Father, you've seen my work firsthand. You know how much I've studied this trade. I expected curiosity. I got laughter. Margaret has a keen business mind. She understands how to cultivate relationships with the right people. That's why I've decided to invest in her idea instead. Thank you, Father, she said sweetly, tilting her head. I'll make you proud. The town of Silver Creek was baking under the late afternoon sun. Dust swirled lazily in the air as wagons rattled down Main Street. The scent of fresh leather and sawdust drifted from the saddleries, mixing with the tang of sweat and whiskey rolling off passing cowboys. It was a town built on horses, cattle, and money, and the Calloway family sat near the top of that empire. I stood in the grand parlor of the Silver Creek Businessmen's Association, my hands gripping a bundle of finely crafted saddle sketches. My heart pounded with anticipation as I watched the men around me sip their whiskey, their laughter rolling like a summer storm across the polished wood floor. This was my moment. I had spent years working leather with my own hands, studying the weaknesses of traditional saddles, perfecting designs that would last longer, fit better, and, most importantly, ride smoother for cowboys spending weeks on the range. Adjustable stirrups, reinforced stitching, lighter weight without sacrificing durability, features no one else had thought to prioritize. And now, standing before the most powerful men in Silver Creek, I was ready to make my case. I turned toward my father, Silas Calloway, the patriarch of our family and one of the largest ranch owners in the territory. His presence alone commanded respect, broad-shouldered, with a graying beard and a gaze as sharp as a bowie knife. Father, I began, voice steady, you've seen my work firsthand. You know how much I've studied this trade. With the right investment, I can build a saddlery that will put Silver Creek on the map. The room went quiet. I expected curiosity. I hoped for consideration. Instead, I got laughter. The first chuckle came from William Hargrove, a cattle baron who owned half the land outside town. Then it spread like wildfire, deep, throaty laughter shaking the room. Men leaned back in their chairs, shaking their heads, their amusement thick enough to choke me. Now that's rich, Hargrove said, wiping a tear from his eye. A little lady trying to start her own saddlery? And here I thought we were discussing serious investments. Another voice chimed in, Jonas Pratt, the town banker. Miss Calloway, women don't run leather shops. They sew curtains and mind the homestead. Who's going to take a saddle built by a girl seriously? I felt my nails dig into the soft paper of my sketches. With respect, Mr. Pratt, I don't sew curtains, I replied, my voice cool but firm. I've spent years perfecting these designs, and I have first-hand knowledge of what riders need in the field. If you just look at— Enough! The single word came from my father. I turned to face him, my throat tightening. Silas Calloway wasn't a man who spoke idly. When he made a decision, it was final. And the look in his eyes told me exactly what his decision was. Elanor, he said, voice as steady as the ground beneath our boots. Your mother raised you to be a lady, not a tradesman. I won't have my daughter elbow deep in cowhide, begging men for business. It's shameful. My stomach dropped. I opened my mouth to protest, but he shook his head. You want to be involved in the family's business? He gestured across the room, across the men who had spent the last 5 minutes mocking me. Then support the family and your sister. Margaret Calloway, my younger sister, sat gracefully poised in the corner of the room, her delicate hands folded in her lap. She was everything Silver Creek adored in a woman, elegant, charming, and perfectly aligned with high society, and, most importantly, Father's favorite. He continued, his voice filled with admiration. Margaret has a keen business mind. She understands how to cultivate relationships with the right people. That's why I've decided to invest in her idea instead. A slow, sinking dread filled my chest as Margaret smiled, a soft, polite thing, but the flicker of victory in her eyes was unmistakable. Thank you, Father, she said sweetly, tilting her head. I'll make you proud. My hands trembled at my sides as realization dawned on me. He had already made up his mind before I even walked through that door. While I had been sketching, designing, and working with my own hands, Margaret had been whispering in his ear, presenting herself as the safer investment. The obedient daughter, the one who wouldn't embarrass him. And just like that, She had won. Callaway Leather & Co. would be hers. All the resources I had dreamed of, the money, the workshop, the network of suppliers, would go to her instead. Not because she was better, but because she was easier to control. I turned to my father, my voice tight with betrayal. "You're making a mistake." His expression didn't change. "The only mistake would be letting you throw away your future on a fool's dream." I felt something inside me snap. I walked out of that meeting humiliated, heart pounding so violently I thought it might break free from my ribs. Margaret didn't gloat. She didn't need to. She simply watched me with an unreadable expression as I gathered my belongings, as I saddled my horse, as I rode out of town without looking back. I left Silver Creek with nothing but my designs, my skills, and a fire burning so deep in my chest that it felt like it might consume me. But as I passed the town limits, one thought settled in my mind, sharp as a brand against my skin. I will return. And when I do, I won't be the one begging for an investment. I will be the one taking everything they once denied me. The town of Silver Creek hadn't changed much in the past decade. The same dirt roads stretched through the center of town, lined with weathered storefronts and a saloon that reeked of whiskey and bad decisions. The same men still gathered outside the general store, swapping tall tales and spitting tobacco into the dusty street. The air still carried the scent of horses, leather, and ambition. The scent of a town built on the backs of ranchers and businessmen, where fortunes were made with cattle and lost in the blink of an eye. But I wasn't the same girl who had left this place in disgrace. I had returned not as Elanor Callaway, the girl they mocked and cast aside, but as E. Callaway, the name whispered with admiration and curiosity across the western frontier. I rode into town on a sleek black stallion, its tack gleaming with polished silver buckles. Every inch of my attire, the fitted leather coat, the hand-stitched boots, the custom hat with a crisp, slanted brim, was crafted from my own designs. The moment I crossed into town, heads began to turn, and people didn't recognize me, not yet, but they recognized quality when they saw it. The way my saddle sat smooth and unblemished, despite miles of riding, the cut of my gloves, the rich scent of treated leather that clung to my presence, all spoke of meticulous craftsmanship. The whispers started almost immediately. "Who's that?" "Never seen her before." "Look at that saddle. Ain't seen craftsmanship like that in years." I dismounted slowly, letting the dust settle at my feet before tying my horse to the same post I had used 10 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on me. A decade ago, I had left Silver Creek with nothing but my name and my designs. Now, I had more money than any man in this town, more influence than they could comprehend, and the perfect plan to destroy the people who once laughed in my face. And first on my list, Margaret Callaway. I didn't go storming into Callaway Leather & Co.'s demanding revenge. No, that wasn't my style. Margaret had won the battle 10 years ago, but she had no idea the war was still being fought. I took my time, moving through Silver Creek like a ghost from the past, keeping my distance while I studied my enemy. And what I saw confirmed what I already suspected. Callaway Leather & Co. was falling apart. At first glance, the store still had the shine of success. The wooden sign over the storefront was polished, the display window filled with neatly arranged saddles and boots. But look closer, and the cracks in the foundation were everywhere. The leather wasn't the same high-quality craftsmanship I once valued. The saddles were mass-produced, lacking the fine details and personal touch that made true artisans stand out. The customers, fewer than before. Margaret's once loyal buyers were losing faith, and I could hear their complaints with every passing conversation. "Damn thing broke after a month. Ain't worth the price." "Told you, they ain't making 'em like they used to. Might as well buy from the tanner down in Laredo." "She raised the prices again? I ain't paying that for a boot that won't last the season." A slow smile curled at the corner of my lips. Margaret had never been a craftsman. She didn't know the trade, didn't understand the work that went into making quality saddlery. She had relied on name recognition, on my father's connections, on the reputation I had once fought to build. And now, that reputation was fading. The Silver Creek Businessmen's Association, the same group of men who once laughed at me, were starting to question Margaret's leadership. I overheard their murmured discussions in the saloon, saw the way they exchanged uneasy glances whenever Callaway Leather & Co. was mentioned. She's losing contracts, you know. Hargrove pulled out last month. Says he don't trust the quality anymore. If she don't find new investors soon, that company's going under. The weight of their doubt was growing, and Margaret was too arrogant to notice. I watched her one afternoon as she stepped out of the store, dressed in the same pristine riding skirts, her hair pinned up like she had just stepped out of a portrait. To an outsider, she might have looked the part of a successful businesswoman, but I saw the truth in the tightness of her jaw, the way her fingers clenched her ledger just a little too hard. She was nervous. She knew she was in trouble. And that was the opening I needed. Margaret still had her father's name. She still had her connections, her illusions of control, and her desperate belief that she could turn things around. But I was going to strip those things away one by one. I wasn't going to ruin her outright. No, that would be too easy. Instead, I was going to let her destroy herself. And when the dust settled, when she was left with nothing, I would walk into her office, look her dead in the eyes, and take everything she once stole from me. She wouldn't just lose the company, she would lose her name, her status, and the belief that she was ever my better. The stage was set. Now, all I had to do was wait for her to fall into my trap. Margaret Callaway was nothing if not predictable. She had built her business on borrowed money and empty promises, trusting that her father's name and the town's old alliances would always carry her forward. She had never faced real struggle, never had to fight for success with her own hands. Margaret's company was crumbling, and she was desperate for a lifeline. She needed a solution fast, and that's where I came in. I had spent the past few weeks studying her financials from the outside, watching as she struggled to cover debts, lose clients, and frantically court new investors. But none of the town's old businessmen wanted to sink their money into a failing enterprise. So, I made sure she found exactly what she was looking for. When we first met, I introduced myself as E. Callaway, a wealthy businesswoman from New York, with strong financial backing from the East. I walked into her office dressed in a tailored riding coat, leather boots polished to a perfect shine, and a hat tilted just enough to shadow my face. I wore quality, the kind of quality that spoke of success without a single word needing to be said. Margaret looked me up and down, trying to gauge whether I was a threat or an opportunity. Ultimately, she saw money. "Miss Callaway, was it?" she asked, offering a charming, if slightly wary, smile. I wasn't aware we had any Callaways back east. "We don't," I said smoothly, keeping my tone neutral, unreadable. "But I'm not here to talk about my family. I'm here to talk about your business." That caught her interest, so I laid out my proposal calmly, carefully. "I've been following the Western markets, and I see a gap. The cattle business is expanding, and leather goods are in high demand. Your company, Callaway Leather & Company, has the right name and position to dominate the industry." Margaret perked up at the praise, pride flickering in her expression. "That's exactly what I've been saying," she agreed quickly, eager for validation. "We just need the right investment to expand, and I raised a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "Let's talk business first." I pulled out a crisp bank draft, setting it neatly on the table between us. The figure, a substantial investment, just enough to make her eyes widen, shimmered like a golden ticket. "I don't make investments without assurances, Miss Callaway," I continued smoothly. "I'd need a stake in the company naturally, nothing drastic. You'd still be the face of the brand. I'd simply be a guiding hand, a silent partner." I saw the exact moment greed overtook caution in her mind. Margaret was drowning, and she had just been thrown a rope. She didn't stop to wonder why I was so willing to invest in a failing business. She didn't stop to question why I was so eager to stay in the shadows. All she saw was money. And just like that, she signed the contract, binding herself to the very person who had come to destroy her. The moment my name was on the papers, the real work began. Margaret was too self-absorbed to notice my influence creeping in. She still believed she was in control, that she had found a benefactor who would save her from ruin. She had no idea I was here to bury her for good. I started small with tiny changes and minor adjustments. Changes that on the surface seemed like brilliant business strategies. Ideas that Margaret eagerly accepted without thinking. We should streamline production, I suggested casually one afternoon, flipping through her latest sales reports. Reduce the number of saddle variations. Focus on mass appeal rather than custom craftsmanship. Margaret jumped on the idea immediately. That's smart, she said, nodding. Fewer designs, more efficiency. We'll increase output and lower costs. She didn't realize that by cutting the uniqueness out of her saddles, she was driving away her most loyal customers, the ones who had once trusted Callaway Leather & Co. for quality. Within a few weeks, complaints began rolling in. The stitching's weaker than it used to be. This ain't what I ordered. Callaway's saddles used to last years. What happened? Margaret dismissed them at first, brushing them off as insignificant gripes. But as the bad reviews spread, so did the losses. And I wasn't done. Once Margaret started relying on my guidance, I nudged her toward bigger risks. You should expand west, I told her one evening over a private business meeting in the office. The railroads are pushing further and new settlements are cropping up every day. If you move fast, you'll secure contracts before anyone else. Margaret's eyes lit up at the idea. A monopoly on the western markets, she murmured, falling for the bait without hesitation. That would put us ahead of every other saddlery in the region. What she didn't realize was that the expansion would stretch her resources too thin. More warehouses, more transport costs, more debt. And the best part, I had already secured deals with suppliers in those regions under my own name. Within a few months, the cracks were too deep to ignore. Customers stopped buying. Suppliers raised prices. Workers quit, complaining of overwork and lower pay. Margaret was bleeding money, and I watched her struggle to hold everything together. Why is this happening? She snapped one night, throwing a ledger onto her desk. This company was thriving last year. We should be making more money, not less. I tilted my head, feigning concern. Maybe it's just bad luck, I offered. Or maybe you've been too focused on expanding and lost sight of the quality. Margaret's jaw tightened, her own doubt beginning to take root. She knew something was wrong. She just didn't know it was me. And soon, she wouldn't have anything left to figure it out. Because the next step, I was going to rip the foundation out from under her completely. Margaret Callaway had spent years basking in the illusion of her own success, convinced that the name Callaway Leather & Co. was untouchable. She had always relied on her father's reputation, failing to see that her customers' loyalty wasn't to her, but to the quality they associated with the Callaway name. And now that quality was slipping. I had spent months poisoning her company from the inside, subtly pushing her into bad business decisions, persuading her to cut costs where it mattered most, and expanding too fast for her own good. But it wasn't enough to break her. No, I needed Silver Creek itself to turn on her. And so, I let the whispers begin. Silver Creek was a town built on word of mouth. Deals were made in saloon corners, business decisions were discussed on front porches, and reputations were crafted or destroyed through nothing more than the right whispers in the right ears. I started with the ranchers, striking up a casual conversation at Hargrove's general store, just loud enough to be overheard. Did you hear about the saddle Hargrove ordered from Callaway Leather? Word is, it didn't last a season before the stitching gave out. A few days later, at the town's largest saloon, I let another piece of gossip slip. I heard Callaway is using thinner leather these days. Looks the same, but won't hold up under real work. Then I made sure the workers at the tannery heard another troubling rumor. A buddy of mine says they're behind on payroll, cutting corners everywhere, apparently. Wouldn't be surprised if they start laying off folks soon. The whispers spread like wildfire on the prairie. Within weeks, customers started looking elsewhere. And where did they turn? To me. I had positioned E. Callaway Mercantile as a brand known for quality craftsmanship, something Callaway Leather & Co. was rapidly losing. When customers started questioning Margaret's business, I made sure my own products were ready and waiting. My saddles were tougher. My boots lasted longer. My reputation wasn't tied to an old name. I had built it with my own hands. The Silver Creek elite, ranchers, lawmen, and cattle drivers began switching their orders to my company. And Margaret? She didn't even realize it was happening until it was too late. At first, Margaret dismissed the rumors, telling herself that a few bad orders didn't mean anything. However, her denial crumbled as the declining sales reports began to accumulate, followed by a wave of canceled orders. The final humiliation came when an elite group of ranchers whom Margaret had been courting for months sent their bulk order to me instead. I observed from across the street as she stormed into her office, slamming the door with such force that the windows rattled. Panic consumed her as she felt the power shift, yet she still clung to the belief that I was on her side. This delusion was the most satisfying part for me as the final blow was imminent, and she remained oblivious to its impending arrival. Margaret had spent years borrowing money to cover her mistakes, relying on Callaway Leather & Co.'s reputation to secure loans. She believed that the company's name alone was enough to maintain the trust of the Silver Creek Businessmen's Association, never imagining that anyone would expose the cracks beneath the surface or pull back the curtain to reveal the truth. But I did. The Silver Creek Businessmen's Association held their monthly meeting in the parlor of the Grand Western Hotel, an exclusive establishment frequented by the wealthiest men in town to discuss investments. Margaret had been avoiding them, aware that they would start asking questions she couldn't answer. But on that particular night, they summoned me instead. I arrived impeccably dressed for the occasion, exuding success, competence, and quiet authority with my perfectly tailored waistcoat, custom boots, and a crisp hat adorned with a polished silver buckle. Margaret was also present, her face pale but composed, desperately trying to salvage what remained. I sat across from her in silence, waiting. Then, Mr. Jonas Pratt, the town's most influential banker, cleared his throat and placed a stack of documents on the table. He addressed Margaret in a measured voice, informing her that they had reviewed her company's financials and had some concerns. Margaret forced a smile and inquired about the nature of their concerns. With a sigh, Mr. Pratt opened the ledgers, revealing every bad investment, unpaid loan, and missed deadline in black and white. The Silver Creek businessmen, the same men who had once mocked my designs, now looked at Margaret with utter disappointment. Pratt continued, flipping through the pages and highlighting her company's financial hemorrhaging, months of overdue supplier payments, and reports of dissatisfied customers. He warned that if this trend persisted, Callaway Leather & Company would face bankruptcy by the end of the season. Margaret's fingers trembled against the table as she attempted to dismiss the concerns, claiming they were merely temporary setbacks in citing investments. Pratt raised an eyebrow, questioning whether she was referring to the loan she had taken based on the assumption of increased sales. Silence filled the room as Margaret's face turned ghostly white. The truth was now exposed for everyone to see. Her father's name could no longer protect her. She was broke. The situation was dire. The people Margaret had once relied on were abandoning her. During a fateful meeting, the men at the table stood up one by one, expressing their lack of confidence in her and her company. William Hargrove voiced his unwillingness to invest in a failing venture, while another man cited the company's inability to pay its workers on time as a reason for his withdrawal. Pratt added to the chorus of disapproval, stating that the Callaway name had lost its former prestige. Margaret watched helplessly as her world crumbled around her. She desperately reached out, pleading for more time, but her pleas fell on deaf ears. By the end of the night, all her investors had withdrawn their support. The situation deteriorated rapidly. Within a week, her warehouse was repossessed, and by the end of the month, no bank in Silver Creek was willing to extend her credit. Margaret's business was ruined. The most tragic aspect of this downfall was Margaret's ignorance of the mastermind behind her ruin. She still viewed her silent investor and supposed ally as a source of help, unaware that this individual was about to deliver the final blow. When that happened, she would lose not only her business, but everything she held dear. Margaret Callaway's once promising business empire was crumbling around her. In just a few months, she had gone from being Silver Creek's most celebrated businesswoman to a desperate figure, clinging to the remnants of her failing company. Her warehouses had been repossessed, her investors had abandoned her, and the town's trust in Callaway Leather & Co. had evaporated. She spent a week frantically trying to salvage what remained, seeking loans from anyone who would listen. But the banks had closed their doors to her. The wealthy ranchers who once sought her out for business wouldn't even return her calls, and the workers she had once treated with disdain now spoke of her in the past tense. Margaret was drowning, and there seemed to be no lifeline. I waited until she had exhausted every other option, until she was on the precipice of complete ruin, before I made my move. Then, I had my assistant deliver a simple note to her office. A private investor is willing to help. A buyout offer is on the table. Meet me at the Grand Western Hotel at sundown. Desperate and out of options, she came immediately. When she arrived at the hotel's private business lounge, her hands were shaking, her hair was slightly disheveled, and the dark circles under her eyes revealed her sleepless nights. She was clearly on the edge. Good. She sat down across from me, her eyes nervously darting to the buyout agreement on the table. I allowed her to believe I was a wealthy investor, concealing my identity under the name E. Calloway and maintaining the facade of the silent partner who wanted to save her. "This is your last chance, Miss Calloway," I said, my voice cool and businesslike. "I'll buy out your company, take on the debt, and keep the Calloway name intact. You won't lose everything, only control." Margaret swallowed, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. She started, her voice trembling. "I don't have another choice, do I?" I tilted my head. "No, you don't." Her hands shook as she reached for the pen. With one desperate stroke of ink, Margaret Calloway signed away her life's work. And the moment the final signature was in place, I leaned back, exhaled slowly, and, for the first time in 10 years, removed my hat. Margaret looked up, her exhaustion giving way to confusion. And then, horror. She whispered, her voice barely audible. I smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of my lips. "You didn't just sell your company, Margaret." I let the words sink in, savoring the moment. "You sold it to me." Silence. Then, like a gust of wind before a storm, the realization crashed into her. She understood everything. The whispers in town about the investment, the financial collapse, and the buyout were all about me. I had orchestrated it all. Margaret's denial and disbelief were evident as she trembled and questioned the possibility of my actions. I reminded her of her past transgression, her theft, and my unwavering resolve to reclaim what was rightfully mine. Her perfect composure shattered, replaced by anger and desperation. She blamed me for her ruin, but I merely pointed out that she was the architect of her own downfall. Her furious lunge was met with my indifference as I turned and walked away, leaving her amidst the wreckage she had created. The once powerful and untouchable Margaret Calloway was now reduced to a broken woman, grasping at nothing. And I had successfully reclaimed what was rightfully mine. The next morning, Silver Creek awoke to a transformed reality. The Calloway Leather and Compass sign was replaced with one bearing my name by midday. By afternoon, news of Margaret's ousting and my ownership spread like wildfire. Margaret's enraged entrance and demands for a place in the company were met with my curt dismissal. Her claims of building the company were countered with the truth. I had built it, while she merely sat on the throne as it crumbled beneath her. Her silence spoke volumes, acknowledging the truth in my words. By evening, the Silver Creek Businessmen's Association, who had once mocked me, publicly denounced Margaret's failures and erased her from their ranks. They acknowledged me as an equal, recognizing me as the rightful owner of the company. The applause and recognition I received were the very things I had been denied 10 years ago. Margaret, standing amidst the crowd, was a picture of shame and devastation as she witnessed everything she once owned being handed back to me. Margaret's downfall was complete. The house she inherited was seized, her social circle abandoned her, and her respect shifted to me. With no money, no business, and no allies, the woman who had stolen my dreams and mocked my struggles was now nothing. She had no title, no name, no power. And I had emerged victorious. I had achieved what she never thought possible. I had returned and taken back everything. That night, I stood on the balcony of my new office, looking out over Silver Creek. This town had once been my graveyard, the place where my dreams had been buried. Now, it was mine, the company, the name, the respect. I had built it, lost it, and reclaimed it. And as for Margaret, she would wake up every day knowing that her failure was my victory, that she had spent 10 years mocking my dreams, only for those dreams to swallow her whole. And there was nothing she could do about it because the past was gone. The future belonged to me. The morning after the buyout, the first thing I did was strip away the last remnants of Margaret's rule. The sign outside the workshop, once emblazoned with Callaway Leather and Company, was removed in the early dawn hours. By noon, a new name took its place: E. Callaway Mercantile. It was no longer just about the Callaway name. It was about me. Margaret had turned our father's legacy into a failing business, but I would turn it into something greater than it had ever been. I walked through the workshop, the scent of leather thick in the air, and watched as workers moved hesitantly, unsure of what to expect. Some had been loyal to Margaret out of fear. Others had endured mistreatment, forced to cut corners and sacrifice quality under her leadership. Now they looked to me, and I made sure they knew exactly what kind of leader I was going to be. "If you're here to work," I announced, my voice carrying through the shop, "then you'll work under the same standards I hold myself to: craftsmanship, pride, and quality. No more mass production. No more cutting corners. This business isn't just about money. It's about creating something that lasts." A few men exchanged uncertain glances, but then one voice rang out from the back of the shop. "I knew your father, Miss Callaway," an older worker said, stepping forward. Nathan Tucker, one of the best leather workers in the region before Margaret had run him out. "And I knew you too, before she pushed you out. If you're running things now, I reckon I'd like my old job back." I nodded once. "Then it's yours." That was all it took. One by one, the skilled craftsmen who had abandoned Callaway Leather & Co. under Margaret's mismanagement came back. The same people she had mistreated, underpaid, and ignored were returning because they trusted me, not her. I could feel the tide turning. Margaret had spent years ruling through vanity and ambition, but I had built my success through skill, and now the town of Silver Creek saw that too. Word spread fast. By the end of the first week, the ranchers who had pulled their orders from Margaret were placing new ones under my name. By the end of the first month, the Silver Creek Businessmen's Association, who had once laughed at my dreams, were now attending meetings in my office, eager to discuss partnerships. By the end of the first season, E. Callaway Mercantile was the leading saddlery in the region, expanding beyond Silver Creek into neighboring territories. I had done what Margaret never could. I had taken the Callaway name and turned it into something truly worth respecting. But there was one last piece of unfinished business, and she came to me before I had to go to her. It was nearly midnight when Margaret arrived. I was sitting in my office going over the books when the knock came. I knew it was her before I even opened the door. She stood in the doorway, a haunting vision of her former self. Her once pristine dress was now wrinkled, and her eyes held a desperate tiredness. The sister I had once known, the proud and untouchable socialite who commanded attention in every room, was gone. In her place was a woman stripped bare with nothing left to lose. "Come to gloat?" I asked, leaning back in my chair, observing her with a steely gaze. Margaret stepped inside slowly, her boots scuffing against the wooden floor. Her eyes swept across the office that had once been hers, taking in the sight of me sitting behind the desk she used to command. It was a stark reminder of the power shift that had taken place. She swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper as she uttered, "You ruined me." I didn't answer, letting the silence hang heavy in the air. "Was this all just revenge?" she asked, her voice trembling with emotion. "Did you come back just to destroy me?" Her words were laced with a mix of anger and vulnerability. I studied her for a long moment, my mind drifting back to the past. 10 years ago, I might have been consumed by the desire for revenge. I might have wanted to see her truly broken, to make her feel the same humiliation and despair that I had once felt. But standing there in that moment, I realized something profound. It wasn't just about her. It was about me. It was about taking back what was rightfully mine, about proving that I had always been worthy of the Callaway name, with or without her approval. I stood slowly, stepping around the desk until I was eye to eye with the woman who had once stolen everything from me. My voice was quiet but filled with icy finality as I spoke. "No, Margaret," I said, letting the last words fall like a verdict in a courtroom. This wasn't revenge, this was justice. Margaret flinched as if the truth had struck her harder than any physical blow ever could. She looked around the room again, as if searching for some remnant of herself still left inside it. But there was nothing. Because this was my office now, my company, my town. I turned and walked toward the door, not sparing her a second glance. And when I opened it, I didn't wait for her to leave. She knew she wasn't welcome here anymore. Margaret Calloway had spent her whole life believing she was above me. Now she stood in the dust, watching as Silver Creek embraced the sister she had once mocked. And as I stepped back into my office, I didn't look back. Because the past was finished, and the future belonged to me.